Imagine this. The year is 475 AD. The sun beats down on the dusty streets of Ravenna. A young boy, no older than 15, is declared emperor. His name is Romulus Augustulus. He is not a mighty general. He is not a wise statesman. He is a pawn in a game played by powerful men. The boy walks through cavernous palace halls. He sees mosaics of great victories. He sees statues of Augustus. He sees statues of Trajan. They built an empire reaching the sands of Syria to the misty shores of Britain. But that empire is now a shadow of its former self. Romulus can feel the fear in the air thicker than the summer heat. The treasury is empty. Soldiers haven't been paid in months. They are restless and angry. News comes from beyond the Alps, Germanic tribes on the move. They are not just raiding. They seek new homes, new lands to settle. They eye Italy's fertile fields. The Roman legions that once held them back are gone, hollowed out by decades of civil war. Romulus sits on a throne far too big for him. He plays with wooden soldiers and old scrolls. Now the real soldiers, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, mercenaries who fight for gold, not the eagle. 1 year later, 476 AD, Odoacer marches on Ravenna. He spares Romulus, takes crown and robes. He sends them to Constantinople. The West no longer needs an emperor. The last Western emperor fades into history. 1,000-year power officially ends. But why? How did this mighty power fall? The fall of Rome was not a single event. It was a long, slow process of decay, and a major part of this decay came from the top. The empire suffered from a terrible crisis of leadership. After the golden age of emperors, like Marcus Aurelius, the system broke down. In the 3rd century AD, the crisis of the 3rd century Rome had more than 20 emperors in just 50 years. Most were generals who seized power with their armies. They were often assassinated by their rivals. They were even killed by their own troops. This constant civil war was a disaster. The body of the empire was at war with itself. Imagine trying to run a country when the leader might be murdered next week. Long-term plans became impossible. The government turned unstable and chaotic. Emperors were too busy surviving to govern. They could not fix the economy. They could not secure the borders. Consider the Praetorian Guard. Intended as the emperor's protectors, they became kingmakers. They assassinated emperors they disliked. In 193 AD, they auctioned the imperial throne. That auction shows how broken the system was. When an emperor's own bodyguards sell the empire, you're in deep trouble. This failure of leadership weakened Rome from within, leaving it vulnerable to every other problem. An empire runs on money. Soldiers need to be paid. Roads need to be built. Forts need to be supplied. For centuries, Rome's economy was powered by conquest. When the legions conquered a new territory, they brought back gold, slaves, new lands to tax. But by the 2nd century AD, the empire had stopped expanding. The flow of new wealth dried up. Suddenly, Rome had to pay for its massive army and bureaucracy with the money it already had. The expenses were enormous, but the income was shrinking. One of the first solutions was to raise taxes, but the rich were very good at avoiding taxes. So, the burden fell heavily on the small farmers and the working class. Taxes became so high that many farmers simply abandoned their land. Another disastrous solution was to debase the currency, but over time, the coins contained less and less silver. People realized the money was not worth as much as it used to be. This led to rampant inflation. They started to barter, trading goods directly instead of using coins. The complex trade-based economy of the empire began to break down into a series of local subsistence economies. Trade between different parts of the empire slowed to a trickle. The Great Road Network, which had been a marvel of engineering, fell into disrepair because there was no money to maintain it. While a few wealthy landowners lived in luxurious villas protected by private armies, the majority of the population struggled with poverty and insecurity. The economic heart of the empire was failing. While Rome was rotting from within, immense pressure was building on its borders. For centuries, the Romans had fought against various tribes they called barbarians: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, and many others. For a long time, the Roman legions kept them at bay along the Rhine and Danube. By the 4th and 5th centuries, everything changed. These were not just small raiding parties anymore. Entire peoples were on the move. Historians call this period the Great Migrations. One major factor was the arrival of the Huns. They were fierce and skilled horsemen who swept into Eastern Europe in the late 4th century. They conquered and terrorized the tribes living there, like the Goths. Fleeing the Huns, huge groups of Goths arrived at the Danube River, the border of the Roman Empire, in 376 AD. They were not looking to invade. They were refugees, seeking protection and a place to live inside the empire. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens agreed to let them in, but the local Roman officials treated them horribly. They stole their food. They enslaved their children. Finally, the desperate Goths rose up in rebellion. In 378 AD, they faced a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople. In a stunning and catastrophic defeat for Rome, the Gothic cavalry crushed the Roman legions. Emperor Valens himself was killed in the battle. The gates had been breached. From that point on, the floodgates opened. In the winter of 406 AD, the Rhine River froze over. Vandals, Alans, Suebi poured across the frozen river into Gaul. A few years later, in 410 AD, the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, did the unthinkable. They marched on the city of Rome itself and sacked it. The Roman Empire was a victim of its own success. At its peak under Emperor Trajan in 117 AD, it was absolutely enormous. It stretched from Scotland to Iraq, from Portugal to the Black Sea. Governing such a vast and diverse territory was a monumental challenge. It required a huge and expensive army to defend thousands of miles of frontier. It also required a massive civil service to collect taxes, administer justice, keep the peace. For a while, Rome managed this incredible feat. The famous Roman roads allow legions and messages to move relatively quickly, but eventually the empire simply became too big to manage effectively. The military was stretched to its breaking point. The number of soldiers required to guard the long borders was immense. As economic problems grew, it became harder and harder to pay and equip this massive force. It also became difficult to find new recruits. Roman citizens, especially the wealthy, were no longer eager to join the army. The life of a soldier was hard, dangerous, and not as rewarding as it once was. To fill the ranks, emperors began recruiting from barbarian tribes they were supposed to fight. These non-Roman soldiers were known as foederati, or federates. Germanic soldiers could be excellent warriors, but their loyalty wasn't always to Rome. They were loyal to their commanders, who were often their own tribal chieftains. This turned the Roman army into a mercenary force. By the 5th century, the army was Roman in name only. When Rome couldn't pay, These armies turned on their masters. The very people hired to defend the empire became its biggest threat. One of the most significant changes in the late empire was its formal division. The empire had become too large and complex for one man to rule from one city. As early as 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian decided to split the administration. He created a system called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, 2 junior emperors, the Caesars. One Augustus ruled the West, the other ruled the East. Over time, that administrative split became a real cultural and political divide. Western Roman Empire based in Italy, largely Latin-speaking. Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, founded by Constantine in 330 AD, largely Greek-speaking. The East was wealthier, more urbanized, more populous, easier to defend, shorter land borders, a capital built like a fortress. The West was more rural, less populated. Long, vulnerable frontiers on the Rhine and on the Danube. The two halves began to drift apart. Separate governments, separate armies, separate priorities. When the West was attacked by migrating tribes, the East often did little. Sometimes the East even saw it as an opportunity. Eastern emperors sometimes paid off barbarian leaders like Attila to turn west. The empire was no longer single-minded. That lack of cooperation was fatal for the West. The Eastern Byzantine Empire survived and thrived for another 1,000 years. The division didn't cause Rome's fall, but it ensured the other half would stand by and let it happen. While civil wars raged and barbarians massed on the frontiers, the Roman Empire was fighting another war against an enemy it could not see. This enemy was disease. In the middle of the 3rd century, during the height of the political crisis, a devastating pandemic swept across the empire. It is known as the Plague of Cyprian, named after a Christian bishop in Carthage who described it in detail. At its peak, the plague was said to have killed as many as 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. This massive loss of life had a profound and lasting impact. There were not enough farmers to work the fields. With so many young men dead, it became almost impossible to find enough new soldiers for the legions. More than just the numbers, the plague shattered the morale of the Roman people. It seemed like the gods had abandoned them. The traditional Roman pagan religion offered little comfort or explanation for such widespread and horrific suffering. As the old certainties of the Roman world crumbled, a new force was rising: Christianity. While pagans fled the sick, Christians were known for caring for them, often at great risk to themselves. The turning point came with Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Before a crucial battle in 312 AD, Constantine supposedly saw a Christian symbol in the sky promising victory. He won the battle, and from then on he favored Christianity. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, granting religious tolerance across the empire. Later in the century, Theodosius I made Christianity the official state religion. The old pagan temples were closed. Their funds were redirected to the church, popes, bishops. They often wielded more local authority than government officials. But this shift also diverted resources and talent away from the traditional civil service and military. Society's focus shifted from the earthly empire to the promise of a heavenly kingdom. The fall of Rome was not caused by one single thing. It was a perfect storm of interconnected crises. Weak and corrupt leaders created political chaos. Economic collapse driven by inflation, crippling taxes, created poverty and unrest. The overstretched military, forced to rely on untrustworthy mercenaries, could no longer defend the vast frontiers. External pressures from migrating tribes, themselves pushed by forces like the Huns, became too great to resist. A devastating plague decimated the population, crippling the workforce and the army, and a profound social and religious revolution changed the very soul of the empire. It is like a building with a crumbling foundation. Each problem made the others worse. It all spiraled downwards until the entire structure collapsed, at least in the West. The story of Rome's fall has fascinated people for centuries because it holds up a mirror to our own societies. It shows how even the mightiest and most sophisticated civilizations are fragile. Political, economic, military, social. They are forces that every great power must grapple with. The tale of Rome is a cautionary one, a lesson written on a grand scale across the pages of history. And so, we are left with a powerful and unsettling question. We look at the ruins of the Colosseum and the Roman Forum, majestic even in their decay. Or are the echoes of Rome's fall a warning, quietly resonating through our own world today?